The story of Mexico's 201st Fighter Squadron, the famed Aztec Eagles, begins not in the jungles of Luzon or the skies over the Pacific, but in a nation thousands of miles from the front lines. In 1939 and 1940, as Europe plunged into war and Asia erupted in flames, Mexico stood determinedly neutral. The country was rebuilding itself after decades of internal turmoil, stabilizing its economy and strengthening its national identity. To many foreign observers, the idea of Mexico engaging in a global conflict seemed almost impossible. To Axis commanders, it was laughable. In Berlin, Rome, and Tokyo, analysts described Mexico's military capability as symbolic, limited, even non-existent. German officers joked that Mexico's air force, the Fuerza Aérea Mexicana, possessed more parades than planes. Italian diplomats wrote that Mexico's involvement in any war would be politically decorative only. Japan barely acknowledged Mexico's existence at all. In the Axis worldview, Mexico was irrelevant, a country lacking the strength, training, or resources to influence a war being fought by the world's greatest empires. But beneath the surface, Mexico was changing. The country had begun to modernize its industry, expand its infrastructure, and build economic ties with the United States, whose factories were starting to awaken into the full power of industrial mobilization. Mexican oil, in particular, became a strategic resource, vital to American industry and Allied logistics. Germany noticed, and as the Kriegsmarine intensified submarine warfare in the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico, Mexico suddenly found itself pulled into the conflict. In early 1942, two Mexican oil tankers, the Potrero del Llano and the Faja de Oro, were torpedoed and sunk by German U-boats. The attacks shocked the nation. Civilians died, sailors were lost, and Mexico realized that neutrality offered no protection. The public, once divided on entering the war, unified almost overnight. Newspapers demanded retaliation. Citizens marched in protest. Politicians who had once argued for staying out of the conflict now urged Mexico to stand with the Allies. On May 28, 1942, Mexico formally declared war on the Axis powers. Around the world, the reaction was predictable. Axis officers in Europe scoffed. One German analysis boldly stated, "Mexico will send nothing." A Japanese propaganda broadcast dismissed the declaration as a symbolic gesture from a nation without an air force. Even some Allied commanders wondered whether Mexico could or would contribute anything significant to the war effort. They would all be proven wrong. Mexico understood that joining the war meant more than political statements. It meant sacrifice, commitment, and action. And so, in 1944, as the Allies prepared for the final offensives against Japan, Mexico made a historic decision to form an expeditionary air unit, a fully trained, fully equipped fighter squadron that would fight alongside the United States in one of the most brutal theaters of the war. 300 volunteers were selected from more than 5,000 applicants. These men came from every corner of Mexico: farmers, students, mechanics, and career military pilots. Despite cultural stereotypes, the selection process was rigorous. Medical screenings eliminated more than a third. Psychological tests removed others. Only the strongest, smartest, most disciplined candidates were accepted. They were sent to the United States, far from home, far from their families, to train under the U.S. Army Air Forces. This alone shocked Axis analysts. No Latin American country had ever deployed a combat squadron overseas. Many European nations with far larger air forces never sent expeditionary units. But Mexico was determined to prove itself. Training began in Pocatello, Idaho, where the Mexican volunteers learned English military terminology, American aerial tactics, and the foundations of modern air combat. There were long days of formation flying, hours spent in classrooms studying engine systems, and endless physical conditioning. Several U.S. instructors privately doubted the squadron would ever see combat, but as the weeks passed, their doubts began to fade. The Mexican pilots showed discipline, adaptability, and a hunger to excel. From Idaho, they were transferred to Majors Field in Texas, where they trained on the aircraft they would eventually take into combat, the Republic P-47D Thunderbolt. The Jug, as American pilots called it, was one of the most rugged fighters of the war, a massive engine bolted to 8 tons of armor, steel, and firepower. For the Mexican volunteers, it was a machine they learned to respect almost immediately. American officers expected the training period to expose weaknesses, but instead it highlighted strengths. The Mexican pilots mastered gunnery drills, practiced dive-bombing runs, and learned how to coordinate with ground forces. They studied aircraft maintenance, survival techniques, and emergency landings. By late 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces formally declared the 201st Fighter Squadron combat-ready. Still, skepticism persisted. Some U.S. commanders doubted the squadron would see real action. Others believed it might be kept out of combat for political safety, a symbolic force rather than a battlefield unit. But those doubts evaporated the moment the squadron arrived in the Pacific. In early 1945, the Aztec Eagles were deployed to the Philippines, one of the bloodiest fronts of the war. The campaign to liberate the islands from Japanese occupation was reaching its climax, and the U.S. 5th Air Force needed every available fighter unit. Without ceremony or fanfare, the Mexican squadron was integrated into the 58th Fighter Group, a battle-hardened American formation that had fought from New Guinea to Luzon. The reception was cautious but respectful. The Americans were skeptical, not maliciously but realistically. They had seen foreign units arrive with insufficient discipline or training. They had no reason to assume this squadron would be different. They would soon discover how wrong they were. From the moment the Aztec Eagles flew their first mission, they demonstrated an intensity and level of precision that surprised even veteran U.S. commanders. Their first combat sorties were escort missions, protecting American bombers on raids over Luzon. These missions were dangerous, full of anti-aircraft fire, unpredictable weather, and the constant threat of Japanese ambush. The Mexican pilots performed flawlessly. As they gained experience, their role expanded. They soon began flying ground attack missions deep into enemy-held territory. These operations were brutal. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its massive radial engine and heavy armor, was ideal for close air support. But flying low meant every pilot faced the full fury of Japanese anti-aircraft guns. Shrapnel tore through wings, engines overheated, and pilots returned with bullet holes in their canopies and fuselages. Yet the Aztec Eagles kept flying. Their missions took them over the Cagayan Valley, a dangerous region filled with entrenched Japanese positions. They destroyed artillery nests, strafed supply lines, attacked troop columns, and bombed bunkers carved into the jungle. Several of their sorties directly supported U.S. ground units struggling to break through fortified lines. American officers repeatedly praised their accuracy, especially during dive bombing runs, where timing, nerve, and precision meant the difference between success and disaster. Japanese forces, initially unaware of Mexico's participation in the war, were stunned. Reports intercepted by U.S. intelligence noted the presence of new enemy fighters performing unusually effective ground strikes. For the first time in history, Japanese troops were fighting Mexican pilots. Axis propaganda, which had mocked Mexico's declaration of war, now fell silent. The Aztec Eagles flew more than 90 combat missions, many in weather so violent that American commanders canceled operations for lesser experienced units. They attacked Japanese positions on the road to Apari, supported the liberation of northern Luzon, and provided cover during strategic assaults that finally broke Japanese resistance in the region. Most astonishing of all, the squadron suffered 0 losses to enemy aircraft. No Japanese fighter ever shot down an Aztec Eagle. Their only casualties came from accidents and anti-aircraft fire, a tragic reality of close air support. 5 Mexican pilots were lost, and their sacrifices became national symbols of Mexico's commitment to the Allied cause. By the time the war ended, the Aztec Eagles had gone from being dismissed as a political gesture to being celebrated as one of the most disciplined and effective foreign units to fight alongside American forces. Their achievements earned respect across the Allied command. General Douglas MacArthur personally commended them. U.S. pilots who once doubted them became some of their strongest admirers. For Mexico, the squadron became proof that the nation was no longer a peripheral actor in world affairs. It had contributed blood, effort, and courage to the defeat of tyranny. It had earned a place in the history of the Pacific War. And for the Axis, The squadron stood as one more example of a miscalculation, a mockery turned into humiliation. The pilots who once laughed at the idea of Mexico sending airmen to the Pacific learned that determination, training, and discipline mattered far more than stereotypes and arrogance. This was the legacy of the 201st Fighter Squadron, a group of volunteers who left their homes, trained in a foreign land, and flew into the heart of a brutal war to prove that Mexico could and did shape the course of history. When the 201st Fighter Squadron first stepped onto the steaming runways of the Philippines, the war was already in its bloody final chapters. The Japanese still held vast stretches of northern Luzon, deep within the mountains. Well-camouflaged bunkers, caves, and artillery nests continued to inflict heavy casualties on Allied forces. The liberation was far from complete. The jungles hid entire battalions of entrenched troops. Rivers and valleys were lined with machine gun emplacements, and Japan, desperate and cornered, fought with the determination of an army that understood it had nowhere left to retreat. For the Mexican pilots, the transition from training grounds in Texas to the war-scarred villages and humid airfields of Luzon was immediate and harsh. Their base, Porac Airfield, was little more than a patch of jungle cleared by engineers. The smell of fuel mixed with the scent of wet earth, the sound of engines drowned out the buzzing insects, and above all, there was the constant tension of an enemy hidden in the mountains, watching, waiting. Despite these harsh realities, the Aztec Eagles carried themselves not as guests in an American war, but as equal partners. Their presence was unprecedented. Mexico had never deployed combat troops overseas in its modern history. Every pilot knew that each mission carried symbolic weight, not just for their squadron, but for their country. The Americans of the 58th Fighter Group welcomed them cautiously. These U.S. pilots had survived New Guinea, Biak, and Leyte. They had fought in brutal dogfights against the Zero, lost friends to anti-aircraft fire, and crash-landed on jungle airstrips. They were professionals hardened by years of tropical warfare. A foreign squadron, even one well-trained, had to prove itself. The Aztec Eagles did so immediately. Their first escort missions revealed a calm, precise discipline. Mexican pilots flew tight formations, responded instantly to instructions, and maintained radio discipline that impressed even the stricter American officers. Their gunnery accuracy was sharp. Their navigation in thick tropical haze was flawless. When they were assigned to cover bombers striking Japanese positions in Luzon, they maintained formation even as anti-aircraft bursts erupted beneath their wings. Within days, the Americans realized that this squadron was not here for symbolic reasons. They were here to fight. After their first successful escorts, the Aztec Eagles shifted to their primary and most dangerous mission, ground attack. Dive bombing with a P-47 Thunderbolt was an art and a test of nerve. The aircraft weighed more than 8 tons, and when it plunged toward the ground with a 2,000-pound bomb strapped to its belly, the pilot faced G-forces that strained every muscle. The Mexican pilots learned to control their dives with surgical precision. They rolled inverted, pointed the nose straight down toward Japanese gun pits, and held their aim until the last possible moment before releasing their bombs and pulling up sharply. Each dive brought them face to face with the reality of Japanese anti-aircraft fire. 20mm cannons spitting bursts that tore through steel and aluminum, machine guns lacing the sky, and sometimes even concealed guns firing from beneath jungle camouflage. One pilot described the experience in his diary. The sky turned black with bursts. I felt the wings shake, heard metal breaking, but I kept the target in sight. When I pulled up, the smoke rose behind me. That was our job, to go straight into the fire and come out alive. The Japanese defenders took notice. Reports intercepted from Japanese ground units referred to new enemy aircraft flying with surprising aggressiveness and accurate strafing. These were the Aztec Eagles. Their missions expanded rapidly. They attacked bridges and supply dumps in the Cagayan Valley. They struck fuel depots hidden under palm fronds. They bombed troop concentrations in mountain passes where Japanese forces attempted to regroup. In one mission, the squadron helped destroy a fortified roadblock that had stalled American infantry for days. In another, they provided cover for engineers trying to repair a damaged bridge under sniper fire. Their P-47 Thunderbolts became feared symbols. The Japanese learned that when they heard the distant rumble of the Thunderbolt's massive engine, a brutal assault would soon follow. The Mexican pilots grew accustomed to flying so low during strafing runs that the tops of palm trees scraped their wings. Not once did a Japanese fighter intercept them. Although the threat existed early in the campaign, Japan's air power in the Philippines had been largely destroyed. The skies belonged to the Allies, and now to the Aztec Eagles. But their greatest challenge was not the enemy in the air, it was the enemy on the ground. During one mission over northern Luzon, a formation of Aztec Eagles descended on a Japanese supply column, retreating into the mountains. The pilots lined up their strafing runs, machine guns blazing. Japanese troops scattered for cover. Anti-aircraft bursts erupted from hidden emplacements. Shrapnel peppered the U.S.-made planes. A 20mm shell tore into the wing of Lieutenant Carlos Garduño's Thunderbolt, nearly shearing off the aileron. Despite the damage, Garduño maintained control, finished his attack run, and flew his crippled aircraft all the way back to base. The Americans who inspected his aircraft were stunned. "There's no way this plane should have made it home," one crew chief muttered. But Garduño had, through a mix of discipline and sheer willpower. Stories like this became common. U.S. commanders took note. The Mexican squadron began receiving praise in daily operation briefings. After completing a series of particularly dangerous missions supporting troops clearing the Bataan Peninsula, the squadron earned formal commendations. General Douglas MacArthur himself praised their performance and expressed admiration for their courage under fire. The U.S. pilots who once doubted them now followed their work with respect and at times awe. But the danger never disappeared. The low altitudes required for ground attack made the pilots painfully vulnerable. Anti-aircraft guns did not discriminate. The air around the P-47s filled with shrapnel, smoke, and fiery bursts. Weather over the Philippines could turn deadly in minutes. Walls of rain, sudden tropical storms, violent downdrafts that pulled aircraft toward the ground. Many missions ended with pilots landing on runways slick with monsoon rain, fighting to keep their wounded planes upright. In total, the Aztec Eagles flew more than 90 combat missions, each one contributing directly to the liberation of Luzon. They destroyed enemy gun pits, supply lines, and key defensive positions. Their precision made them ideal for supporting infantry advances through mountain terrain, where Japanese troops stubbornly resisted every step. Their impact grew so visible that Allied units began requesting the Mexican squadron specifically. American ground commanders praised the accuracy of their strikes. Infantry officers spoke of the Thunderbolts with Mexican colors that saved their troops from encirclement. Japanese forces, once dismissive of Mexico's involvement, recorded in later accounts their shock at being attacked by a foreign unit they hadn't expected to fight. Soldiers described strafing runs that pinned them in trenches, bombs that obliterated concealed positions, and the terrifying noise of the P-47 diving toward them. Yet for all their accomplishments, the Aztec Eagles paid a heavy price. During a mission near the end of the Luzon campaign, a squadron formation flew into intense anti-aircraft fire while striking Japanese artillery hidden in the jungle. A burst of ground fire struck Captain Pablo Rivas Martin's Thunderbolt, causing catastrophic engine failure. Unable to reach the airfield, he crash-landed on a rough patch of terrain near American lines. Although he survived the landing, he died of injuries shortly after. His sacrifice became one of the squadron's most honored memories. Other pilots were lost to accidents, a grim reality of the Pacific theater. Mechanical failures, weather, and the sheer stress placed on aircraft during dive-bombing missions claimed additional lives. But even with these losses, the Aztec Eagles never failed a mission. They never turned back out of fear. They never broke formation or abandoned their role. And remarkably, they never suffered a single loss to Japanese fighters. Their record spoke for itself. A foreign expeditionary unit that arrived in a brutal theater of war and earned distinction among some of the most experienced American forces in the Pacific. They had flown with courage equal to any Allied squadron, proving wrong every Axis analyst who had dismissed them as a political gesture. As the fighting in the Philippines neared its conclusion, the Aztec Eagles earned the respect not just of U.S. commanders and troops on the ground, but of the Filipino people as well. Civilians who witnessed their missions wrote letters of gratitude. Local leaders praised their bravery. To many in Luzon, the sight of a Thunderbolt painted with the Mexican tricolor signaled hope, an international stand against the darkness that had consumed their islands for years. For Mexico, the squadron became a point of national pride even before the war ended. Reports of their successes spread quickly across newspapers and radio broadcasts. Families anxiously followed updates from the front. When the pilots wrote home, their letters spoke of camaraderie, hardship, and purpose. They understood that they were writing a new chapter in Mexican military history. And for the United States, the Aztec Eagles were a reminder that the struggle against the Axis was not only an American effort. It was a coalition, a united front, and in that coalition, Mexico, once mocked by Axis propaganda, proved itself a reliable and formidable partner. By mid-1945, the war in the Philippines was entering its most grueling phase. The great battles that liberated Manila and secured central Luzon were over, but the northern mountains remained infested with tens of thousands of Japanese troops determined to fight to the death. These were not disorganized stragglers. Many were elite units of the Shobu Group, commanded by General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya. They were entrenched in caves, bunkers, ravines, and forests so dense that even Allied scouts doubted they could be uprooted. And yet, uprooting them became the daily mission of the 201st Fighter Squadron. If earlier operations had been difficult, the final months of the Luzon campaign represented the climax of the Aztec Eagles' combat experience. Their missions shifted from mixed escort roles to intense close air support against fortified positions that American infantry struggled to eliminate. Every strike required absolute precision. American soldiers advanced only a few hundred yards each day, and in that suffocating jungle terrain, the difference between hitting the enemy and striking friendly lines was measured in seconds. The Mexican pilots had earned the trust to perform these surgical missions. Their P-47 Thunderbolts dove into ravines so narrow that the surrounding cliffs sent echoes of their engines rolling for miles. They blasted machine gun nests camouflaged beneath bamboo scaffolding. They destroyed mortar pits hidden in small pockets of trees. They turned Japanese fortifications carved into the mountainside into smoking craters that infantry units could finally assault. The terrain was the enemy as much as the Japanese were. The mountains created violent updrafts. The weather shifted unpredictably, from blinding heat to sudden storms that brought sheets of rain so thick pilots could barely see their own wings. Radios failed. Engines overheated. In some missions, pilots had to abandon the planned attack and improvise their own strike routes because haze made the original targets invisible. Despite these challenges, the Aztec Eagles never suffered a single loss to enemy fighters, a stunning achievement that reflected both the destruction of Japan's air force and the discipline of the Mexican squadron. Yet losses still came. On one late war sortie, the squadron was tasked with destroying a series of fortified ridges in the Cagayan Valley that had pinned down American infantry for several days. The area was a maze of hidden anti-aircraft guns, many of them hastily mounted in truck beds or dug into small hillsides. During the attack run, Lieutenant Mario Lopez Portillo's Thunderbolt flew directly into a concentration of 20mm flak bursts. Shrapnel crippled his engine, and the aircraft began to lose altitude rapidly. Lopez Portillo attempted to nurse the plane toward friendly lines, but crashed before reaching them. He died shortly after the crash. His sacrifice shook the squadron. To the Mexican pilots, the loss of a single man was profound. They were a tight-knit group far from home, and every absence left a painful void. But even in mourning, they continued their missions. They had vowed to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Allies, and they kept that promise. As the summer of 1945 approached, the tide of battle shifted decisively. American ground forces pushed deeper into the mountains. The Japanese resistance, once fierce and organized, began to splinter under the relentless pressure. Food and ammunition shortages ravaged their ranks. Desertion within isolated units grew common. Soldiers surrendered, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone, starving and exhausted. The psychological effect of the Aztec Eagles' continued strikes was undeniable. Captured Japanese diaries revealed the fear they instilled. One soldier wrote, "The skies scream with metal. These new American planes, the ones with the foreign markings, come in low and destroy everything. We hide in the caves, but they find us." Another wrote, "To be attacked by Mexico, This war has brought hell to us from nations we never imagined. Axis propaganda, once mocking and dismissive of Mexico's capabilities, had long since collapsed under the weight of reality. U.S. commanders, too, acknowledged the squadron's contribution with increasing recognition. Letters of commendation flowed into the Mexican camp. Officers in the 58th Fighter Group praised their discipline and reliability. Ground units spoke of their courage. Even American pilots, who had initially viewed them with skepticism, now referred to the Mexican squadron with admiration and camaraderie. The final missions of the 201st Fighter Squadron came shortly before Japan's surrender. In July 1945, the squadron was ordered to attack remaining pockets of Japanese troops near Kyongin in northern Luzon. These last-stand fortifications were manned by soldiers who refused to yield despite knowing the war was lost. The Aztec Eagles flew multiple sorties in support of the ground offensive, destroying caves, suppressing sniper nests, and clearing paths for infantry to advance. After each mission, the pilots returned to their base, exhausted but unbroken. Their planes bore the scars of battle, bullet holes patched with fresh aluminum, soot marks on the wings dense along the fuselage. Ground crews worked tirelessly to repair them for the next day's operations. Then, in early August, the world changed. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki triggered a rapid collapse of Japanese resistance across the Pacific. News reached the Mexican squadron in short bursts over radio transmissions. Pilots gathered around officers reading communiques that indicated the war, after so many years of destruction, might finally be approaching its end. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its unconditional surrender. The Aztec Eagles received the news with a mixture of relief, disbelief, and solemn reflection. They had flown the final missions of Mexico's only foreign combat deployment in World War II. They had endured heat, storms, anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failures, and the loss of close friends. Now at last, their part in the global war was finished, but their journey was not. When they departed the Philippines in late 1945, American personnel lined the airfield to bid them farewell. The respect was genuine, earned through sweat and steel. The Mexican pilots boarded transport ships carrying not just their gear and uniforms, but memories that would follow them the rest of their lives. Their homecoming was historic. On returning to Mexico City, the Aztec Eagles marched through the capital in a celebratory parade. Crowds filled the streets, waving flags and cheering. Families wept with pride. Government leaders praised the squadron's courage and discipline. For a nation that had long remained neutral in global conflicts, the sight of heroes returning from overseas combat was transformative. Their role in the war reshaped how Mexico viewed itself, no longer a distant observer, but an active contributor on the world stage. In the decades that followed, the 201st Fighter Squadron became an enduring symbol of Mexico's commitment to global security. Monuments were erected in their honor. Museums dedicated entire wings to their history. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once flown by the squadron, was preserved and displayed for future generations. Films, books, and documentaries told their story. Veterans returned to the Philippines for commemorative events, standing once again on the ground where they had fought so bravely. Even today, the legacy of the Aztec Eagles resonates beyond the borders of Mexico. Their participation in World War II marked the first and only time that a Latin American nation deployed a fully equipped combat squadron to fight overseas. They were pioneers in international military cooperation. They represented a powerful example of national unity in a time of global threats, and they shattered stereotypes held by both allies and enemies alike. In Japan, historians and veterans studied the role of the squadron with a sober appreciation. Their diaries and testimonies acknowledged the shock of encountering an unexpected adversary, one whose determination matched any major Allied power. In the United States, the squadron became a symbol of partnership and shared sacrifice. The U.S. Air Force and Mexican Air Force developed strong ties that endure to this day because of the bond forged in Luzon. And in Mexico, their story remains a source of national pride, a reminder that courage is not measured by the size of an army, but by the willingness to stand against tyranny when the moment demands it.